Welcome everybody to the Washington chapter, Capital Area Chapter ICEAA 2023 Luncheon Series, and we're starting today. And let me share my screen. Today we have Jenna Meyers from the OSD Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, CAPE, joining us to present DoD sustainment reviews. Well, background on Jenna. Jenna has a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and began her career in the DoD working in the Army Communications Electronics Command in 2008 as an Ops Research Analyst. And in 2014, Jenna took a position as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army Cost and Economics, DASA, where she prepared Army cost positions and eventually served as the DASA CE Technical Advisor. In 2023, Jenna left the Army to join OSD Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, CAPE, where she serves as a CAPE focal point for sustainment reviews. Let's switch presentations here. 1 second. All right, Jenna, welcome.
Great, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everyone's eating their lunch and have something exciting to eat for lunch, or more exciting than I have. I'm Jenna Meyers, and as George said, I work for OSD CAPE, specifically in the Land and Naval Warfare Cost Analysis Division. And I have been serving as the CAPE POC for sustainment reviews for the last few months, but I do want to give you a little bit of background. I came to CAPE in October, so pretty recently, but before that, as George said, I was at the Army for a number of years. And I just want to let you know, because a lot of my examples are a little Army heavy, since I did work the sustainment review process from the Army side for several months before coming to CAPE. As an administrative note, I can see the chat, so if you have any questions, either feel free to unmute, or if you want to type them in the chat, I will definitely do my best to answer them as we go along. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, please. So our sustainment review journey, so to speak, we'll start with a review of the statute and policy, and then I'm going to go into what's actually included in a sustainment review and how the services have been implementing over the last few years. And then finally, we're going to hit on some of the lessons learned from an OSD CAPE perspective. Next slide. So essentially, a sustainment review is an examination of the performance and cost effectiveness of a system's product support strategy. And what that really means is you're going to look back at your system's historical data in terms of things like reliability and availability and those types of metrics, as well as your historical cost data. And you ask yourself, essentially, how did we do? But before we dig too far into what that actually means, I do want to take a step back and try to answer the question, why do we care about sustainment, or why should we care about sustainment? And since I know everyone here is a cost analyst or loves cost analysis, I think we all know it's pretty safe to say that sustainment is expensive. And I'm sure we've all seen that infographic that shows O&S as something like 60 to 70% of life cycle costs, depending on the commodity. I actually think that graphic is in the CAPE O&S manual. But in reality, as a department, we're still struggling to wrap our arms around the totality of weapon system sustainment. And that's from tracking the actual expenditures of O&S back to a specific weapon system, to understanding the full breadth of sustainment activities that are actually driving those costs. So we could start by looking at the O&M budget, which I have in the bottom right there. But I'm sure we all know here, O&M doesn't capture all of O&S. It's not that simple, since O&S actually is going to encompass multiple appropriations, not just O&M. So yes, we know sustainment is expensive, but how expensive? And then once we can answer that question, or start to answer that question, a few other ones unfold. Like, how much does it cost to increase my system's availability or reliability? Or another important one, are we prioritizing funding in a way that aligns with our readiness goals? And one that's important to this community, can we do better at capturing the right sustainment data to inform our investment decisions and our cost estimates earlier in the life cycle? And these are the types of questions that the sustainment reviews aim to shed light on. So hopefully with that, I've kind of sold you a little bit on the value of looking closer into sustainment, but we can get to the other side of why we do it, and that's because the law says we have to. So sustainment reviews were actually in, I think it was the 2017 NDAA, but they were inconsistently implemented across the services. So I was working at WCAC at that time, and we did actually start doing sustainment reviews at that time, but to a much lesser degree than the Army is doing them now. So really it wasn't until that 2021 NDAA that the department started to fully implement sustainment reviews in their current form. And that was because that language included a few key new items. The first is that the services need to submit their sustainment review package to Congress at the end of the fiscal year. And we're going to talk about exactly what's included in that package in the next slide. The second, and this is a big one for this community, that they established a new critical cost growth metric. And this one goes hand in hand with the requirement to develop a sustainment review ICE. So essentially you develop your sustainment review ICE and then you compare that against both your previous ICE, and that's your category A, and then you also compare it against the estimate that originally baselined your program. So usually that's like your milestone B APB estimate, and that's your category B. And so for programs that have a growth of either more than 25% for category A or 50% for category B, those programs have critical growth. When you have critical growth, you need to submit either a remediation plan, basically what are you going to do to fix it, or a certification that the growth is necessary for national security. So a non-trivial amount of documentation goes along with that critical growth. The next thing the language did is define who has to do the sustainment reviews. And they did this by defining covered systems. Typically, you'll see a covered system as an MDAP, but not an MTA. But in the covered system and part of this language, it actually does say the MDAPs and the major MTAs. And then lastly, the NDA did include language to say that GAO will review the sustainment reviews with a focus on cost growth. And I actually just saw an email come in that GAO is ready for the services to review the report for 21. So we are working on that right now as they've wrapped up the report on the 21 sustainment reviews. So clearly we see Congress is interested in sustainment and they are clearly interested in cost. But now let's get into what's actually included in a sustainment review. Next slide, please. So each year, the services have a list of programs that are going to be reviewed that year for the sustainment reviews. For each program, they have to address each of these 10 data elements. For today, I'm going to focus on two of them, the two that are boxed in, and that's the independent cost estimate for the remainder of the life cycle of the program. That's what we're going to call the sustainment review ICE. And the other one is the analysis of whether accurate and complete data is being reported in the cost systems. So those are the two we're really going to focus on. But if you look at all the other data elements, you'll notice they are very cost heavy. So cost of reps and cons, cost effective source of repair, cost of IT, cost of software, etc. And another thing I'll note is that a lot of these data elements are going to leverage the same historical data sources that are used to inform the ICE. So there's definitely a relationship there. And as an analyst, you definitely can stand to gain something by paying attention to all of these elements, as it definitely gives you awareness about those other data sources that are being used to inform these data elements. And so, next slide, please. Yes, major MTA is the middle tier of acquisition pathway programs. And sorry, I'm responding to and I will get to that question, Jack, about how many are actually showing critical growth. And then, yes, the major MTAs are the MTAs that are, I think major makes it a ACAT 1 or 2, but over the 5-year period. That's what a major versus a non-major MTA is. Okay, so we went over the 10 data elements, but now I'm going to quickly kind of touch on what some of the guidance and policy that has been issued. So Congress gave us those 10 data elements. And then ANS released a memo providing some supplemental direction and also restating some of the statute. So a couple of the key points in their memo. The first is to remind everyone sustainment reviews occur within 5 years of IOC and every 5 years thereafter. And that's important because really getting your documentation in line for that sustainment review is important because you're going to have to do it again in 5 years. And I can tell you right now, I said the Army started doing sustainment reviews in 2017. We're seeing those programs come back this year. And reliving that has been interesting for the Army because it's definitely driven home how important it is to document all of the assumptions, all of the data sources, etc. So the second thing that the ANS memo specified is that the services need to provide an updated list of covered systems every year with a rough idea of when the sustainment reviews will take place. And the third is that for any program that has a critical cost growth, the service needs to brief their planned response at the sustainment review. So basically, are you going to certify? Are you going to go through a remediation, etc.? And then the last is that the services need to upload their briefings and documentation to AIR. And that makes sense because AIR is where all of the acquisition documentation goes. And so it's helpful to have the story of a program all in one place. So additionally, since OSD CAPE has the authority to establish cost estimation policies and is also responsible for doing or delegating ICEs, CAPE released a memo shortly thereafter providing additional guidance for 21. I do want to note that CAPE released a similar memo in 22 and then again in 23, but today we're going to focus on the highlights from the 21 memo. So the first thing it did is it delegated the 21 ICEs to the services, and I can tell you CAPE also delegated the 22, but in 23 CAPE is doing the ICE for at least one Navy program. But the memo did specify that the ICEs need to be conducted in accordance with the 5073. And this is specifically with regards to the timelines for when programs have cost kickoffs, when they submit the card, when they brief CAPE on the ICE, and so on. And I'll also note that the 73 does have a specific timeline for a delegated sustainment review. So the next thing is that the sustainment review documents need to go into CADE, but really what we're looking for there is a focus on the documents that are cost related. So the ICE memo, the ICE briefing, the card, the final card, I should say. But then we also ask them to load in that sustainment review package to give the rest of those documents a little more context. The memo also emphasized the review of data sources, both to better understand services VMOS systems and to evaluate SysDR compliance. And we're going to talk more about those two things in a little bit. And then lastly, the memo specified that CAPE would review the services congressional package and submit a report of findings to the secretary of each MILDEP. And the intent there is to continue to improve the sustainment review process and try to incorporate lessons learned from year to year. And before we move on from this, I do want to note that we did hear the services basically, and I'll say that CAPE as well, it's difficult to find some of those sustainment review documents in the CADE library right now. And so we're working on some minor enhancements to the CADE library so that it's a lot easier to hone in on the sustainment review documentation. So like I said, when you come back in 5 years and you want to look at all those documentation that existed from the previous sustainment review, it's a lot easier to find and things are grouped together. So we're working on those enhancements and they will absolutely be out before the FY23 sustainment reviews need to be loaded into CADE at the end of the fiscal year. So you might be thinking, both of these memos came out in June, but didn't you say the congressional package is due in September? And that is true, and that is a good observation, but I do want to take the opportunity to note that CAPE does need to have the full list of systems that are going to be doing a sustainment review for that year before we release our delegation memo. And so we've been in a bit of a bind in the last few years just to make sure we have the no kidding locked in list for the services before we issue that memo. But I will say CAPE is trying very hard to get our memo out sooner. We've been getting it out sooner each year, but we still need to do better so that the services have the full year to implement whatever we're specifying in the memo for providing additional supplemental direction or instructions, things like that. So then next slide, please. So then moving on to the high level process that we follow from CAPE's perspective. So as I noted, first the services are going to decide which systems they're going to review. And that sounds like an easy task, but the step of defining the boundary lines of a single covered system has proven to be quite a challenge in some cases. So as an example, the way each of the services handle major modifications and whether or not those are included within the purview of the original covered system is different. And that is completely okay. It just requires a very good line of communication at the onset to ensure the scope's clearly defined. So once the services provide that list, then CAPE issues the memo to specify which ICEs are delegated and provide any supplemental guidance. And as I said, we are definitely trying to get that memo out much earlier in the fiscal year. And in the future, we will likely move that supplemental guidance and direction to a different document to ensure the delegation memo can be released as quickly as we know what the systems are. So then the next step is that the services conduct their sustainment reviews using their own processes. So I do want to note the sustainment reviews are a service level meeting. So while CAPE requires that the ICEs follow the CAPE ICE timeline in the 73, the actual sustainment reviews are conducted very differently across the service. And I'll explain more on that in a minute. And then lastly, the services submit their congressional package documenting their sustainment reviews at the end of the year. And as I said, once CAPE gets that final package, we review the documentation in conjunction with those final ICEs, and then we issue a findings memo to the Secretary of the MILDEP. And for reference, some previous findings were things like FAMOS deficiencies, like if they were missing cost elements or the cost allocations were done incorrectly, if there were issues with the card, and then of course a lack of CSDRs, which again we will talk about. So as I noted, the services conduct the sustainment reviews using their own processes. So what that looks like for the Army is that they actually hold a sustainment review kickoff, then they have 3 IPRs, and then a final sustainment review meeting. And the intent of those IPRs is to craft the package that goes to the sustainment review meeting. Now the Navy calls their sustainment review Gate 7, and that's run more similar to a typical milestone. And then the Air Force does not conduct a single sustainment review meeting with OSD, but they do staff their sustainment review documentation within the Air Force. So again, 3 different processes, which is okay. It's just something that we OSD need to acknowledge and work around. So now let's take a look at how the department did in 21 and 22. Next slide, please. So in 21, the Army and the Air Force completed 13 sustainment reviews, and the Army had critical growth on 2 of their programs. As a reminder, critical growth is measuring your current sustainment review ICE against both that previous ICE and your milestone B, typically, your milestone B estimate. So the Navy didn't do sustainment reviews in 21, but they did start in 22. So once they started in 22, the services completed a total of 22 sustainment reviews, and then there were 7 total critical cost growths. So some overarching observations. So first, as I already noted, the services are definitely using different processes to execute the sustainment reviews. And as an example, critical growth is actually done a little differently depending on the service. So in FY21, the Army, and then in FY22, the Army and the Navy, they looked at their critical growth at the total ONS level versus the Air Force, which looked at it on a unitized level. And I do want to say that both methods are okay. We've checked with legal. They're just different ways of doing it. So the next observation on the positive note is that the quality of their sustainment review packages has already increased significantly. You can definitely see that the services are getting a better understanding of sustainment data, and they're getting ahead of a lot of the common issues early in the process. And then last, there's definitely similar issues and pain points across the services, and one of those is definitely the category B comparison. So the category B comparison requires you to go back to your original baseline estimate. And of the 13 reviews in 21, only 3 were able to complete that comparison. That was largely due to the age of many of the systems being reviewed in 21. If you went to your milestone B in the 80s, for instance, then you're probably not going to have an estimate that you can find that has documented ONS costs. In 22, things were better. 11 of the 22 were able to complete it. But again, this is largely going to be driven by the availability and detail of old cost estimates and cost models. So basically, if you have to certify or have a remediation plan, you have to know the methodology of what's driving those cost differences. So it's not enough to have a top line number. And so as a note, so I said there was 2 critical growths in 21, there were 7 in 22, so 9 total. So I would have expected most of those to be category B, because again, milestone B, you barely knew what you were estimating there, but it's actually been completely split. What I mean by that is 3 category A, 3 category B, and 3 were both a category A and B, which just means they breached both. And I'll give a more specific example. For those critical growths in 21 for the Army, both of those were Cat A and Cat B, and they had pretty common issues driving the growth. So both of the systems had a significant increased procurement quantity and several costly modifications and upgrades that were not previously included in any of the other estimates. And all of that will be documented in the GAO report as well, since that is focused on those 2 programs. And I know, Jack, you had asked how many are doing corrective plans or remediations. That's a good question. I should go back and check. I think I can only easily off the top of my head actually think of 1 program that I think is doing a remediation. I think most are doing a certification, but I'll have to look into that detail. That's a good question. Next slide, please. So with that, 21-22 is definitely a huge learning opportunity for the services. But then now let's look at the data availability. So we'll start with the good news. Each of the services VAMOS, which are the systems that are used to track and report ONS, so that's your Navy VAMOS, your OSMIS, and your AFTAC, those are all being used for at least a portion of the ICE. So the sustainment reviews are serving to highlight deficiencies in the VAMOS systems, but the services are definitely working to correct those issues wherever they can. And additionally, CAPE is using the sustainment reviews as an in-depth learning opportunity for eVAMOS. And where possible, eVAMOS is actually being used to look at data for the ICEs as well. So currently, this specifically applies to specific commodities in the Army. So I think we have a hot mic. Eventually, we're hoping to be able to use eVAMOS across more as well. So the less good, but definitely not surprising news for most cost analysts is that if your program is using CLS, you just have less available costs. That's because if you're using CLS, typically needs some form of contractual deliverable to get that detailed insight into the costs, which is a great segue into CAPE's review of the CSCR, which is the Cost and Software Data Report. I'm sure most of you are familiar with CSDRs, which is the deliverable we use to standardize the collection of cost data, not price data, but cost data. And remember that one of the data elements requires the services to report on the accuracy and completeness of our cost systems. And that's going to include looking at the CSDR's. So in the FY22 CAPE memo, CAPE actually provided a CSDR data collection template, basically asking every program to list out their contracts using a specific template. And the reason we did that was both to try to understand how many contracts we had out there for sustainment, but also to check if we were getting CSDR reporting on all of the contracts that tripped the threshold, all of which are documented in 73. So I only have that data for the 22 sustainment reviews so far, but below that graphic is showing the compiled data. So as a reminder, there was just 22 programs, 22 sustainment reviews in 22. So across those 22 programs, they reported 64 contracts. Of those 64 contracts, 55 hit the threshold for CSDR reporting, but of those 55, only 14 had CSDR plans. So of the roughly $23 billion, you only have detailed cost data coming in for about 8 billion of those contracts. So if you're thinking 22 programs and only 64 contracts seems low, exactly what I was thinking as well. And I can definitely tell you this is a lower bound because not all programs provided the contract template, because again, we didn't get that memo out in time to affect all of our programs. So this is definitely a lower bound, but we did add this template to the 23 memo, and we will continue to add this or collect this on an annual basis. that we can both monitor how we're doing on CSTR metrics, but also be informed of other CSTR plans that need to be developed and what needs to go on sustainment contract.
Jenna, this is Kathleen from Technomics. I just had a question.
Yeah, sure.
Current slide. In that chart with the counting the number of contracts, is that just sustainment contracts, or is that contracts that could represent development or acquisition on these programs that are in sustainment?
Yeah, so the template does not specify sustainment contracts. It only specified contracts over, I think, like 20 million is what we said. But I can tell you from looking at the 22 data, it was, if not all, sustainment contracts. But I do know for 23, this is a great question, by the way, I do know for 23, because I've already seen some of them filled out, we're going to get a lot more of that continuing acquisition type contracts. So that'll be interesting. Because obviously we don't want to say that's a sustainment contract, but we do want to know about it from a CAPE perspective to ensure we're tracking CSTRs. And then not to mention, a lot of times you'll have some amount of contractor logistics support or ICS on some of those contracts, so it is still value added to collect that. Okay, and thank you, that was a good question. So to kind of wrap it up, I want to get into what our lessons learned have been from a CAPE perspective. Next slide, please. So starting from a general sustainment review documentation perspective, the first is that the sustainment reviews are definitely a lot of work. They're a lot of work for the cost analysts, a lot of work for the PSMs, obviously, everyone in the program office. It's just a lot of work. And so definitely would recommend making it count versus making it a check the box type of exercise. But like I've said, we are definitely starting to see the services use this process more to discover these issues. And a lot of these issues are kind of systemic issues. They're going to be common across the programs or the commodity, but they're definitely working to discover them and then try to figure out how do we fix this. So the next observation is that the data elements in the sustainment review package should be consistent with the ICE. But what I really mean by that is twofold. The first is pretty obvious. So the ICE documentation that's provided to CAPE should align to the final sustainment review package ICE. So there's an ICE documented in that sustainment review package. We have our ICE documentation. Basically, we're looking to make sure those things are the same. But then the second is that if the historical cost data in ICE tell a story, then we would expect that to come across in the other metrics and data elements as well. And what I mean by that is, if your story is that your program has always been underfunded and your reliability and your availability have suffered because of that, we're going to expect that maybe you're not exactly using your historical data to forecast. Maybe you're doing something to increase that essentially, because the argument would be, well, my historical data was budget constrained and it wasn't getting me what I needed. And so just that story or understanding of how those things connect is what we're looking for. We're just trying to make sure it makes sense, really. And then the last, from a broad perspective, is that sustainment actuals are difficult to extract, and that can be more or less difficult depending on the service, the commodity, and the support strategy. Like I talked about, CLS contracts may not hit the VAMOS systems at a usable level of detail, or they may not hit it at all. And if you don't have a contractual deliverable like a CSTR, we may be left without sufficient insight into those costs, which makes it very difficult to do a detailed estimate for sustainment. And then the other is that based on the way we budget and execute O&M, it can be challenging to tie those funds back to a specific weapon system. So again, from my Army experience, I can tell you tracking O&M dollars back to a specific weapon system for certain cost elements is near impossible right now. So definitely something that the EVAMOS team has been pushing forward on, and I think that the future is bright, but it will take some time to get there. Then moving on to the ICE and cost growth. So the first is that programs really need to communicate their ICE assumptions early. And this includes things like what's the scope, is there additional development and production, how will modifications be handled, which variants of the systems are included. And since we know GAO will be reviewing critical cost growth, programs really need to communicate which estimates they're using. So I will say this, it's easy to say, oh yeah, go find the estimate that originally baselined your program. Actually, finding that estimate has proven to be very challenging. So just making sure that we're providing that documentation trail. And like I said about the modifications, that's important because that's come up a lot. The way the Army handles it versus the Navy versus the Air Force, it's different. So we need to make sure we're documenting when we draw that boundary line of a covered system, what's included in there. So another common theme with many of the recent sustainment reviews is that the cost community has used many of the same estimating assumptions for years. So these are things like, this is going to be an Army example, but things like the number of years in the economic useful life, how often we need to do an overhaul for a vehicle to get it to the economic useful life, how often we should do a tech refresh. So we have these assumptions about how often these things need to happen. But now many of the sustainment reviews are showing these assumptions should be challenged and reassessed when we look at the actuals. For example, if we've never refreshed or overhauled in 20 years, do we really need to do it every year, or do we need to do it at the quantity that the program office is laying out? Maybe, maybe not. And so these are just things we need to critically think about. Of course, the difficulty is going to be balancing that historical data, which, like I said, is bound by budgetary constraint, with realistic assumptions for the future of the program that's set up for success. You don't want to just estimate what happened in the past if you know what happened in the past wasn't sufficient. But you might not want to say, well, what happened in the past was 1 a year, but we're going to do 300 a year. That's not really reasonable either. And so really just trying to figure out what are the right assumptions. And then another finding that I talked about, but that comparison to the original baseline estimate is challenging. So again, because we need to defend that critical cost growth in detail, explain, what's going on, it is important to have sufficient detail on your older estimate, which can be difficult for some of the older systems. So simply finding a document with a total for ONS, it really doesn't allow for a meaningful comparison. And that's where, I know CAPE has been really digging into our archives, and I know the services are as well, to make sure that if we have something, we're providing it, but if we don't, we document that we tried, but we can't do that comparison. And then obviously a lot of programs, most programs, have changed dramatically since milestone B. And so it's pretty often that program isn't really the same program anymore. And so some of those comparisons aren't that meaningful. But I will say this, if you have a category B critical cost growth, you do get to re-baseline using your current sustainment review ICE. And so if that comparison is just so bad and so not meaningful, at least you don't have to keep reassessing it every 5 years. You do get to use that new sustainment review ICE as that baseline moving forward. So then lastly, moving on to probably everyone here's favorite topic, which is the data. So sadly, CSDRs are often excluded from sustainment contracts. So again, my personal experience in the Army was that this was largely due to the fact that the PMs didn't own the sustainment contracts, but it could certainly be from a variety of other reasons as well across the services. So we've talked about this a bit at CAPE. We've talked about maybe making updates to the 73 to capture this more clearly of like who's responsible, or even making sure that we extend training to hit at the right sustainment community. But of course, if there's anyone in this forum that has any ideas on how to get better in this area, we are always looking for any kind of ideas. Basically, how do we get better at collecting CSDRs and sustainment contracts? And then lastly, with regards to VAMOS, like I said, there's some deficiencies that have been noted through these sufficiency reviews, or sustainment reviews, sorry, but the services continue to strengthen their systems, and we're definitely seeing them try to get better. But then also the eVAMOS team at CAPE is leaning in to learn from the services and use that opportunity to drive eVAMOS based on their lessons learned. So hopefully between eVAMOS getting better and the VAMOS systems getting better, those future sustainment reviews become a whole lot easier, or at least that's the hope. So I think that is all I have, but I'll turn it over. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm just impressed that my dog stayed quiet for that long, so that was really nice.
Hey Jenna, great presentation. One quick question: have you noticed, milestone B or C cost review board working groups seem to have a sort of feel, and the type of work that occurs seems relatively unique to a system at that point in its life cycle. These milestone estimates done for OSRs, do they seem a lot different? Like do analysts need different skill sets? Does it seem like the things that are being estimated is a lot different? It's not just extrapolation from actuals, or does it really seem like it's an interchangeable process? Somebody who's done a bunch of milestone B cost review boards, you could drop them into an OSR easily. They wouldn't lose a beat, or no, it's a totally different animal?
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents, I mean, I think it's a totally different animal. And that's because you don't have a bunch of historical data at milestone B for the system you're estimating. And so it's going to be like you noted, like a lot more analogy and parametrics and things like that. Whereas when you get into the sustainment review, it's really about what's your capability with data and how are you with analyzing data and being able to know what systems you need to go look at. So obviously the VAMOS systems, but that's maybe not everything. So I will say it's definitely a different animal, both from, like I said, data sources, and then also being able to work with sometimes what is a lot of data. As you know better than anyone, Dan, the Army has their logistic ERPs, which is great, but that just means now you have a lot of data. And so if you decide to go to pull data from an LMP or a GRME, it just means you have to have some good data analyzing skills. I do think actually that there is a, I was actually looking at the ONS credential for DAU. This is a random aside. And I did note that one of the classes they were going to have in there, which I was not tracking, was essentially like data analytics or data science skills for ONS. And I imagine the reason they're doing that is because of what I'm describing, recognizing that it is going to require a different skill set. But as a note, that credential is not out yet. But that's something I'm interested to follow up with to see how they kind of handle that. So hopefully that answers that question.
Absolutely, thanks.
Jack, when you say SCAT, do you mean service category? I don't know if you have the ability.
Yes, correct.
Oh, okay. I have not heard that specifically, though I can imagine for someone making that argument. But I have not personally experienced that. Nor have I, to be honest, I actually haven't experienced any acquisitions that were following a service acquisition pathway, which is, I assume, the only time we would use the SCAT designation. So I actually haven't seen that. So if that's something programs are doing for sustainment, that would be news to me, but I would be interested to know about that.
Yeah, it was just odd. I know after following the C-130J OSR, like AFCA came with some contracts and needed CSDRs and had some meetings with them, and they basically said that, hey, like, yeah, we're still C-130J, but we're SCAT, so don't require CSDR, and a little puzzling, but yeah, still trying to formulate that out.
Okay, no, thank you for letting me know. I will dig into that, Jack. I appreciate it.
Any other questions that, yeah, there's a hand actually, Brian. Go ahead, Brian. Did we have one more question there, Jenna?
I see one question in the chat. Jenna, are these slides, can we post these slides to our chapter website?
Yes. Yeah, these are the, yeah, yes, you can.
All right, everybody. So we'll upload these to our website. I'll drop a link in the chat and they'll be uploaded in the next day or two, I believe. Over.
Oh, I do see Ryan's question. Yeah, CAPE does get involved in all ACAT 1 reviews. And so, yeah, we do emphasize at those milestones, of course, also the importance of the CSDR. I think the sustainment review, we do it a little, well, we always do it heavily, but we really weigh on the sustainment review because of that direct statute language that says a review of the cost databases, essentially. And so we point to that and say, hey, that means we got to dig into CSDRs and VAMOS. So that's why I brought it up here, but that's a good point and definitely something that CAPE analysts should be doing throughout the life cycle as they work through those ACAT 1's milestones.
Everyone, I've posted here the Luncheon survey. You can either scan it or use the link below. But we'd love to hear your thoughts about today's Luncheon, and also the results will help determine our a winner of our Luncheon Speaker Presentation Excellence Award. Jenna, if there's any more questions, you're welcome to continue on. Conclude. I just want to post that out there.
I don't see any more questions, so I thank you everyone for letting me come today and share the joy that is Sustainment Review.
Thank you very much, Jenna. And everyone, we will have two more presentations. We'll have one in March and we'll have one in April, and then we will pause for the ICEAA workshop in May, and then resume our luncheons in June. So we'll look forward to seeing everybody next month.